Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for taking a few minutes out of your visit to the Sixth Floor Museum today to sit with us for this little program. My name is Stephen Fagan. I'm the curator, and you may have heard that we have an election coming up next week, and so we thought it might be a little fun and perhaps therapeutic to step back in time 4 years to the 1960 campaign, that historic race between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. And as we often do here at the museum with our robust collection of artifacts, films, and photographs, we thought it might be interesting to examine this historic race for the presidency through some of the unique artifacts in our collection. So, these two men, these are Saturday Evening Post magazines. You can see the dates up there. Kennedy appeared on the front on October 29th and Nixon on November 5th. The election was on November 8th of 1960. And as you can see, those are Norman Rockwell portraits of the two candidates that were done specifically for the Saturday Evening Post. 1960 was a big year. With the recent additions of Hawaii and Alaska, it was actually the first presidential election in which all 50 states participated. The 1950s were symbolically giving way to something new and decidedly different. One of these men would win the presidency in what became one of the closest elections in American history. Vice President Richard Nixon and Massachusetts Senator John Kennedy. Between these two men, we often think of Kennedy, of course, as the more youthful candidate. But actually, as you can see from their ages here, both of these guys were under the age of 50, and in fact, a mere 4 years separated Nixon and Kennedy. But that fact was lost on most voters because Nixon simply seemed older, and image was very important, just as it is today. Regardless, the winner in 1960 would succeed the oldest president in American history up to that time, 70-year-old Dwight Eisenhower, who was born in 1890. And that meant that this election in 1960 was the first time that someone born in the 20th century, born in the 1900s, would be president of the United States. So let's talk for just a moment about the America of 1960. We were in the midst of an economic recession and at the height of an ongoing Cold War with the Soviet Union, with the threat of nuclear destruction very real during this time. Foreign policy was especially important since Russia had been the first to launch an artificial Earth satellite, Sputnik, in 1957. And the civil rights movement was gaining momentum throughout the South with sit-ins and protests. For Vice President Nixon, it was all about experience and leadership. His 8 years as VP under a very popular president gave him a big edge. Or so he imagined. Kennedy, meanwhile, seized on that sense of change at the dawn of a new decade, and he leaned into that image as a young and vigorous.
Give me your help. Give me your hands and your voice to move America forward. With these words, Senator Kennedy asks the people to support his candidacy and his program. In 14 weeks of campaigning, he attracts enormous crowds. Each of the two candidates travels more than 60,000 miles. They go to small towns and big cities. At railroad stations, airports, and public squares, they meet the people of America. With Vice President Nixon is his wife, Pat. He introduces her to the people, and then he speaks of his program. He speaks of the progress of these past 8 years and the need for keeping experienced leaders at the helm of the nation.
All right. So let's take a look at some of the artifacts in our collection and see what they tell us today about this race for the presidency. So these are a couple of Nixon items here. The postcard at the top, that shows Nixon confronting Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Nixon engaged Khrushchev in a televised debate in Moscow back in 1958, which really made him a Cold War hero in the eyes of many. And so you can see Dick Nixon, the one man to deal with Khrushchev. And look at that dramatic picture. He's got his finger pointing right at the Soviet premier. I mean, Nixon in this image is just the quintessential Cold Warrior of the early 1960s. Nixon really had a pretty traditional campaign approach. Back in 1960, there were definitely red-leaning states and blue-leaning states, but the map was not as defined as it is today. And somewhat surprisingly, Nixon made this pledge that he would personally campaign in all 50 states. And it was a really odd strategy because he had no chance of winning, for example, Kennedy's home state of Massachusetts. But this somewhat old-fashioned approach to campaigning by train at times, as we saw in this video, it really didn't help Nixon. He injured his knee twice, and it became infected, and he ended up in the hospital. So this grueling schedule of going to all 50 states personally really was hazardous to his health. And it's ironic because Nixon, throughout his entire life, had been this healthy and robust individual, whereas John F. Kennedy, a man who had been sickly practically his entire life, he's the one that came across as the more strong, vigorous candidate. So let's contrast some of the traditional Nixon material with these Kennedy buttons that we have in our collection. We have Progress for All. That's a very inclusive and quite a broad message. You can really take that as economic progress or progress with civil rights. It kind of speaks to everyone with that follow-up message, forward, the future, forward thinking, moving ahead to something new and decidedly different than the Eisenhower 1950s. And Kennedy also reached out to the Mexican-American and Puerto Rican communities, seen here with these two buttons at the bottom. Viva Kennedy clubs spread throughout the Southwest, and they were working to increase Latino turnout in 1960. And Kennedy really clicked with the nation's youth. You see in that top button, if I were 21, I'd vote for Kennedy. The voting age, by the way, in 1960 was 21, not 18 as it is today. But if I were 21, I'd vote for Kennedy. That was worn by young people who weren't even, of course, old enough to vote in that campaign. So you might wonder, why would their support matter when they weren't even of voting age? The thing is, they created crowds and they generated this infectious enthusiasm that wouldn't really be seen again until the Beatles arrived in 1964. They elevated Kennedy into something new, this idea of a celebrity politician. And with his good looks and his soaring, inspirational rhetoric, it was easy to get swept up in the Kennedy mystique. You can see all these hats worn by these young campaign volunteers, and we are actually fortunate to have one of those original hats in our collection. So let's take a look at this hat for just a moment. It is made of plastic rather than traditional straw. So even in the materials, this hat spoke to the future with its space-age polymers as opposed to traditional straw. And there are 50 stars all the way around the hat with the abbreviations for the 50 states. This was, of course, the first time all 50 states were going to be voting, and that was a big deal reflected in this hat. And then there on the front, just above Kennedy's name, is a little boat with 60 emblazoned on the bow. That is Kennedy's World War II command, PT-109, which I'll mention a little bit later. Now, not every young person in the country in 1960 was an adoring Kennedy supporter. A recent donation to our collection is this really neat two-page school essay written by a young man, James Brown, in Missouri. And he makes clear his choice, Nixon, the man for the job. Let's read just a little bit of this. Nixon has the built-in qualifications. He already knows how to serve. The best trained, most experienced candidate ever to stand for the presidency, Richard M. Nixon, accepted the 1960 Republican nomination by saying these stirring declarations, and I quote, "We Americans shall rise to our greatest height in this decade of the 60s as we mount the offensive to meet those forces which threaten the peace and the right of free men everywhere. Mr. Khrushchev's grandchildren will live in freedom." I'm not sure what to be more impressed by, his cursive or the fact that an elementary school student in 1960 could quote politicians like that. And I quote. This is a really remarkable thing, and we're grateful to have this in our collection. Let's also take a moment to appreciate the lost art of campaign brochures, which both campaigns used quite extensively in 1960 to get their programs and platforms across to the people. Our examples for Richard Nixon, again, they really focus on the man himself, his experience, and this notion of carrying on the tradition of Dwight Eisenhower. You see in this one at the bottom, it even says, with your support, Dick Nixon will win again in 1960. This idea, will win again, as if somehow Dwight Eisenhower is maybe on the ticket with him. This other brochure, you can see it lists 10 reasons why we should elect Nixon. We'll just look at the first two. Number one, he is experienced. Number two, he is qualified. You can definitely see a pattern here, right? Experience, leadership, qualifications. And with Kennedy, we have something a little bit different. Kennedy focuses more on the voters and the issues that are affecting them. Notice the rhetorical language. Who cares about natural resources? Who cares about your family's budget? It's all about tone, right? Because you could read this today. Who cares about natural resources? Who cares about your family's budget? But these brochures, they wouldn't have been taken quite as ironically as we might take them today in 2024. The idea was, who cares about natural resources? Who cares about your family's budget? The Democrats care. So that's what these brochures were trying to get across. The three pillars that are holding up that little house there at the bottom, they read, people, principle, and peace. So these are easy P words to remember, and those were the words that Democrats would have wanted voters to associate with their party when they went to cast their ballot. Notice that Kennedy's name doesn't even appear on the front of these brochures at all, because in these pieces of campaign literature, it's all about you, the voter. And notice this early example of environmentalism in 1960, talking about natural resources printed on paper from trees. And so we have two more examples here, and look at this. These are targeting different demographics. Worried about old age? Or maybe this is your first vote. Either way, regardless of your age, Kennedy has you covered. Now, beyond brochures, there was this new and powerful medium of television. By 1960, more than 45 million homes had a television set, compared to Nixon's first campaign running for vice president in 1952, when there were only 15 million televisions. Let's take a look for a moment at how Richard Nixon harnessed the power of television in one of his campaign commercials.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Vice President of the United States, Richard M. Nixon.
I want to talk to you for a moment about civil rights, equal rights for all our citizens. Why must we vigorously defend them? First, because it is right and just. And second, because we cannot compete successfully with communism if we fail to utilize completely the minds and energies of all of our citizens. And third, the whole world is watching us. When we fail to grant equality to all, that makes news, bad news for America all over the world. Now, the record shows there's been more progress in civil rights in the past 8 years than in the preceding 80 years, because this administration has insisted on making progress. And I want to continue and speed up that progress. I want to help build a better America for all Americans.
All right, so Nixon actually did a whole series of TV ads just like this. In every one of them, he's in that same office, perched on that same desk in exactly the same way. The only difference is at the beginning he says, I want to talk to you for a moment about something else. He did a whole series of these. A very solid message to get across to voters with that slow pan towards his face. I mean, it's a good use of television, allowing the candidate to make eye contact and connect directly to the voters. That was the way Nixon approached TV. Kennedy had a somewhat different approach. And feel free to sing along.
Kennedy, 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 Kennedy.
Do you want a man for president who's seasoned through and through, but not so doggone seasoned that he won't try something new? A man who's old enough to know
And young enough to do.
well, he's up to you, it's up to you, it's strictly up to you. Do you like a man who answers straight, a man who's always fair? We'll measure him against the others, and when you compare, you'll cast your vote for Kennedy and a change that's overdue. So it's up to you, it's up to you, it's strictly up to you. Yes, it's Kennedy, 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 Kennedy for me. Kennedy, 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 Kennedy.
So a little bit different energy there with Kennedy's campaign commercial, and it's really quite brilliant. It's modern, it's kinetic, it's got a great tune that's going to live rent-free in all our heads for the next couple days. And also those little pictures, I mean, you see them flash by, but it's very strategic. That wasn't just done haphazardly. You might have noticed if you looked really closely, there was a picture of former President Harry Truman, who was a leader in the Democratic Party at that time, again tying Kennedy to this legacy of Franklin Roosevelt. There was also a picture of Franklin Roosevelt's widow, Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, in there. So again, these subtle, without saying a word, without speaking to the voters, communicating this sense of the great Democratic tradition that Kennedy was trying to be a part of. Now, just so you don't think that Kennedy's approach is all fluff, I want to show another one that has a little bit more substance. We saw Nixon's campaign commercial that was primarily focused on civil rights, and Kennedy did kind of a civil rights themed TV commercial as well, but again, he took a different approach than Nixon, sitting on that desk talking directly to camera.
Hi, my name is Harry Belafonte. I'm an artist, and I'm not a politician. But like most Americans, I have a great interest in the political and the economic destiny of my country. I'm seated here with Senator Jack Kennedy. As a Negro and as an American, I have many questions, and I'm sure everyone does, about civil rights, about foreign policy, about the economy of the country, and about things that'll happen.
And I want to make it very clear, Harry, that on this question of equality of opportunity for all Americans, whether it's in the field of civil rights, better minimum wages, better housing, better working conditions, jobs, I stand for these things. The Democratic Party under Franklin Roosevelt stood for them.
I'm voting for this, Senator. How about you?
Vote for a leader like Roosevelt. Vote for John F. Kennedy for president.
African Americans had historically pledged to support Republicans, the party of Abraham Lincoln, but by 1960, that was beginning to change, and Kennedy gained a keen advantage when he helped release Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from jail in Georgia, and this generated a lot of favorable press for the Kennedy campaign, and so ultimately Kennedy won the African American vote in 1960. Television also proved significant beyond TV commercials because it brought the candidates together in your living room for the very first time with the first televised general election presidential debates. Kennedy and Nixon actually participated in 4 live TV debates that year, but it's the first one, which aired September 26, 1960. It's the only one, really, that people remember today. Kennedy paid close attention to where the cameras were going to be positioned. He focused on the lighting. He arrived early. He toured the set. He wore makeup. He really knew how to manipulate the medium of television to his advantage. Nixon, he came prepared to discuss the issues, and he did quite well on that front, but he was extremely uncomfortable on live television. He didn't wear makeup, and so he looked pale and sick. He sweated under the studio lights, and his eyes, they darted around in this kind of shifty manner because he wasn't accustomed to being captured by multiple cameras. One can certainly argue that Nixon had a better grasp of the issues over Kennedy, and Nixon really did a lot better in the subsequent 3 debates, but it was that first debate that cemented the idea that Kennedy was calm, charismatic, and pretty nice looking, whereas Nixon, based on this image projected during that first debate on TV, Nixon looked suspicious and sick and a little bit weird. Now, running mates were also pretty important in 1960, and Nixon gave up a real strategic advantage with his selection for vice president, former United Nations Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, who was from Kennedy's home state of Massachusetts. So it provided no benefit really to Nixon. Kennedy, on the other hand, made a very strategic choice, naming Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson of Texas as his running mate. Johnson was very influential throughout the South, and he made a nice contrast from Kennedy, who was very much this, New England Yankee politician. Kennedy ultimately won the state of Texas by just 2%, and it was almost certainly with the help of Lyndon Johnson. And LBJ was not Kennedy's only secret weapon. He also had a powerful and influential partner in his wife, Jackie Kennedy. Now, Richard Nixon's wife, Pat, she was a wonderful woman, beloved by Republicans, but she was a very traditional campaign wife. She stood silently behind her husband. She spoke only to women's groups and only about her husband's achievements. Jackie Kennedy, on the other hand, she was something different. She was bold and independent. I mean, look at, on Life magazine, the most read magazine of the day, look at that positioning of her front and center with the candidate for president blurry in the background. I mean, that communicates visually exactly what Jackie was being positioned as this different kind of first lady. Earlier, I mentioned these Viva Kennedy clubs trying to increase Latino turnout across the South, and Jackie Kennedy was very much a partner in that effort with this. This is the last campaign commercial we're going to take a look at today.
Queridos amigos, les habla la esposa del senador John F. Kennedy, candidato a la presidencia de los Estados Unidos. En estos tiempos de tanto peligro, cuando la paz mundial se ve amenazada por el comunismo, es necesario tener en la Casa Blanca un líder capaz de guiar nuestros destinos con una mano firme. Mi esposo siempre vigilará los intereses de todos los sectores de nuestra sociedad que necesitan la protección de un gobierno humanitario para el futuro de nuestros niños y para lograr un mundo donde exista la paz verdadera. Voten ustedes por el Partido Demócrata el día 8 de noviembre. Que viva Kennedy.
That was the first Spanish language presidential campaign commercial, also the first commercial to only feature the potential First Lady without actually showing the candidate for president. A really, really remarkable thing there. Earlier I mentioned Kennedy's World War II command, PT-109. In August of 1943, this motor torpedo boat, PT-109, was struck by a Japanese destroyer in the South Pacific, and Kennedy rescued his crewmates, even saving one injured crew member by towing him 3.5 miles to a nearby island with the strap of his life jacket clenched between his teeth. So that harrowing adventure really forged Kennedy's political identity and was his strongest argument against Nixon's experience and leadership. Kennedy was this genuine war hero, and he was fearless in the face of danger and persevered against all odds. He carved a rescue message on a coconut. I mean, that's pretty impressive going back to World War II. And so as a result of this kind of exciting story of heroism, which was made into a movie starring Cliff Robertson as John F. Kennedy, PT-109 merch was real popular during the 1960 campaign. So here are his and hers examples. We have a PT-109 tie clip at the top and then a lady's charm bracelet there on the bottom. Now, Kennedy was running to be the country's first Catholic president during a time of great religious prejudice. And believe it or not, it actually became a significant campaign issue. These are two anti-Kennedy brochures from 1960. Essentially, the argument was that Kennedy would be beholden to the Pope and somehow the Vatican would be controlling the United States. Kennedy addressed these issues head-on in a televised address before the Houston Ministerial Alliance in September. And he famously said, "I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president who also happens to be a Catholic." You know, we're always on the lookout for October and November surprises, and that was the same in 1960. And one of them arrived just 4 days before the election, and it happened half a mile from where we are today, over at the Adolphus Hotel in Dallas, when a mob of political demonstrators protested a visit by Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson. In the span of just half an hour, the Johnsons were allegedly pushed, spit on, and hit with signs. And someone took Lady Bird Johnson's gloves and threw them in the gutter. You can see some of these signs. LBJ, traitor, of course, my favorite, Let's Ground Lady Bird. This incident really embarrassed Dallas, and it generated national news attention, and Lyndon Johnson used it to great political benefit in the last 4 days before voters went to the polls. Johnson gave a number of speeches and interviews characterizing himself as bravely refusing to use a side door at the hotel to avoid the mob and boldly facing down these violent demonstrators while protecting his good lady wife. But there was something more. Johnson was also kind of unfairly using this small pocket of vocal right-wing extremists to represent the entirety of mainstream Republicans at that time. And arguably it did make a difference, particularly across the genteel South, where under no circumstances could you rough up a politician's wife. And so November 8th, 1960, John F. Kennedy won one of the closest elections in American history, although there were accusations of voter fraud, particularly in Illinois and Texas, but Nixon did not contest the election. Look at the popular vote here. Kennedy received 49.7%, Nixon received 49.6%. Does that sound familiar? A national difference of only 120,000 votes. And notice the colors here. So you see Mississippi, half of Alabama, and one elector in Oklahoma are different there. They cast a protest electoral vote for Virginia Senator Harry Byrd, who was a Southern segregationist opposed to the civil rights movement. So after winning this extremely close election on January 20th, 1961, John F. Kennedy was sworn in as the 35th President of the United States. And as he said in his campaign literature, the country transitioned historically at that moment from the oldest president up to that time to the youngest man ever elected to the office. Thank you guys so much for taking a few minutes today to look at the 1960 campaign with me. We do have a handful of replica 1960 campaign buttons. So those of you who have been here for the gallery talk today, if you'd like to go over and see my colleague Emily, she will give you some buttons. We have Kennedy and Nixon represented, so you can have either candidate of your choice. And I'll stick around if you guys have any questions about the assassination. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we can play the song one more time, but I'll go ahead and dismiss this crowd. Thank you guys so much for taking some time to be with us today. Thank you.
Kennedy, 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 Kennedy,